Hello, everyone, and welcome to Learning from Home, and welcome to the Hewlett-Woodmere Public Library's profile of F. Scott Fitzgerald. My name is Dr. Bill Fairfelder, and I'll be your host today. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired professor of arts and humanities and docent emeritus from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I live in Portland, Oregon, where I'm speaking to you from today, and where I'm an artist, writer, and lecturer. I also return regularly to New York, where I continue my work at the museum and, of course, try to enjoy the wonders of the Big Apple. Now, since we can't cover everything about this afternoon's topic in one 75-minute presentation, I'd like to invite you to take a deeper dive on my website, which is makingwings.net. And in this case, it's Deeper Dive 106. Again, for those of you who haven't visited, it's one word, Making Wings, and it's .net. If you click on that, you should see this. And again, just to make double sure, you should see, you'll get my homepage. And what I would like you to do, if you care to, is go to what's called the hamburger menu in the upper left corner. And when you click on that, you're going to see some things in a drop-down. Please feel free to visit any of these, including my lecture schedule. It tells you my upcoming presentations. You see the two groups of deeper dives. Today is number 106, so it's in that second batch. Click on the downward facing arrow. And there you are. You see a bunch of things. These are all programs that I have given or will be giving in the future. And this is 106, so it's kind of down towards the bottom. And so if you click on F. Scott Fitzgerald, you'll be brought to that page, where you're going to find an overview of his life, some recommended media. Now, I will be talking about these books, these recommended things during the presentation. If you don't have a paper and pencil handy, you can copy down authors and titles by going to my website. Printed resources, some video resources, and then printed resources about his major books. There are 9. And then I have some stuff about his wife, Zelda, talk about her in a bit, and about his daughter, Scotty. So there are a lot of things. And then his mistress, Sheila Graham. So lots of cool stuff there. And in terms of, if you want to go and look up some of these things. So for example, if you wanted to go to the bibliographic web resources under print and look up This Side of Paradise, if you click on that, you'll be brought to that page. But when you're done, you can click it off and you're back on my page. So it's kind of like one-stop shopping. So lots of material there, and hope you can take advantage of it. So everything that you're going to hear in the program today uses the web resources and the books that you just saw on my website. But for this presentation, I especially used the following sources to build structure and script, and that is the University of South Carolina, Britannica, Wikipedia, and the Biography Channel, SparkNotes and eNotes, and American Masters on PBS. Now, as I pointed out, on my website, you saw suggested media, and each of these books can give you great insight in the complexities of Fitzgerald's life and writing. But if you had to start with one, I would go to Matthew Broccoli's Some Sort of Epic Grandeur. Broccoli is one of the leading experts on Fitzgerald, and his Opinions are really spot on. And many people consider this kind of the definitive biography of Fitzgerald. But I also recommend Sarah Churchwell's book, Careless People: Murder, Mayhem, and the Invention of the Great Gatsby. Of course, Gatsby is his most famous novel, and we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of its publication this year. So it's a very timely book. Now, today, as the curtains part, what we're going to do is we're going to do a thumbnail overview of his life. And then we're going to explore his four short story collections, the four novels that were printed in his lifetime, as well as his last unfinished novel, which was published posthumously in 1941. Grand total 9 books. Again, for a more detailed look at the biography and the work, as you saw, please visit makingwings.net, Deeper Dive 106. So let's begin by sketching out Fitzgerald's life. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was born into a Roman Catholic family in St. Paul, Minnesota, on September the 24th of 1896. He was named after his distant cousin, who was the author of the poem that would become the words for our national anthem. His father, Edward, was from Maryland and had very deep loyalty to the Old South and its values. And his mother, Molly, was the daughter of an Irish immigrant who had become wealthy as a grocer in St. Paul. Well, when the dad, Edward, failed as a wicker furniture manufacturer in St. Paul, he became a salesman for Procter and Gamble in upstate New York. But after he was dismissed from that job in 1908, when the son, Scott, was 12, the family returned to St. Paul and lived comfortably on Molly Fitzgerald, the mother's family inheritance. Now, Fitzgerald was known as Scott through most of his life. When he was back in St. Paul, attended the St. Paul Academy, and his first writing appeared in the school newspaper. It was a little detective story, and it was published when he was 13 years old. Well, between 1911 and 1913, Scott attended the Newman School, a Catholic prep school in New Jersey, where he met Father Sigourney Fay, who encouraged the young man's ambitions for personal distinction and achievement. Then, as a member of the Princeton University class of 1917, unfortunately, Fitzgerald neglected his studies for his literary apprenticeship. Instead of attending classes, he liked to write. He wrote the scripts and lyrics for the Princeton Triangle Club and was a contributor to the Princeton Tiger humor magazine and the Nassau Literary magazine. Well, because of his poor grades, Scott was put on academic probation, and his chances of graduating seemed unlikely. So as a result, Fitzgerald joined the Army in 1917 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry. Convinced that he would die in the war, he rapidly wrote a novel which he called The Romantic Egoist. And he submitted the manuscript to, he went right to the top. He went to Charles Scribner's son. It was rejected, but the letter of rejection he received praised the novel's originality and asked that it be resubmitted after he had revised it. Well, in June of 1918, Fitzgerald was assigned to Camp Sheridan, which was near Montgomery, Alabama. And there he fell in love with a celebrated belle, the 18-year-old Zelda Zare, the youngest daughter of an Alabama Supreme Court judge. Well, The romance strengthened Fitzgerald's hope for the success of his novel. He rewrote it, and after writing that revision, he sent it back to Scribner's, and unfortunately, it was rejected a second time. But still, with the, this is good. We should work on it more. Okay. Well, the war ended just before he was to be sent overseas. And after he was honorably discharged in 1919, he went to New York City to pursue a career in advertising in order to marry Zelda. But unwilling to wait for Scott to succeed in his career ventures, Zelda broke their engagement. Well, the heartbroken Fitzgerald quit his advertising job at the Baron Collier Agency in July of 1919 and returned to St. Paul, Minnesota to rewrite his novel yet again. And this time, he called it This Side of Paradise. Well, apparently, third time was the charm. It was accepted by editor Maxwell Perkins of Scribner's and Sons in September. Meanwhile, during the same period of the fall and early winter of 1919, Fitzgerald furthered his career as a short story writer for mass circulation magazines. Working through a literary agent named Harold Ober, he was known as Harry, Harold Ober, Fitzgerald was able to get several of his stories very well placed. Indeed, the Saturday Evening Post became Fitzgerald's most stable story market, and he was regarded as a quote-unquote post writer. But he also contributed to other magazines such as The Smart Set. Now, his stories introduced a new kind of character to American literature, and that character is the independent, determined young woman. Well, the publication of This Side of Paradise in March of 1920, so it was accepted in the fall of 1919. It was published in March of 1920. Well, it made the 24-year-old Fitzgerald famous almost overnight. And a week later, he married Zelda in New York. And they embarked on an extravagant life as young celebrities. Unfortunately, his playboy image and his flamboyant relationship with Zelda often hampered the proper evaluation of his work. Indeed, some critics didn't take him seriously because of the way he lived. Now, I'm going to pause here, a little sidebar. Here's as good a point as any to talk about Zelda Zaire, who was born in Montgomery, Alabama in 1900 to a wealthy Southern family, and became known locally for her beauty and her high spirits. Well, after she married Scott, the young couple was catapulted into the public eye. Now, because of their wild antics and incessant partying, she and her husband became regarded as the enfant terrible of the jazz age. But in short order, infidelities on both sides and bitter recriminations undermined their marriage. After Zelda traveled with Scott to Europe, her mental health began to deteriorate, and she frequently required psychiatric care. And ultimately, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia and what today is called bipolar disorder. Now, while institutionalized at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, she wrote her own novel called Save Me the Waltz. We'll mention this again a little bit later. When it was published in 1932, it garnered mostly negative reviews and experienced poor sales. Now, while the experience affected her fragile state of mind, it also led her to pursue her work as a visual artist. And as you can see, she was quite accomplished. Her modernist work was vigorous and kinetic. Well, regrettably, after Scott's death, her recurrent institutionalization for mental illness, all voluntary, by the way, on her part, continually interrupted any attempts at a creative life. Sadly, in March of 1948, while she was a patient at Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, she died in a fire. Her body could be identified only by her dental records and one of her slippers. A follow up investigation raised the possibility that the fire had been the work of arson by a disgruntled or mentally disturbed hospital employee. Well, yes, a sad ending, but fortunately today there is a serious reevaluation of her novel and definitely of her artwork. Well, going back to Scott's timeline, after a riotous summer in Westport, Connecticut, the Fitzgerald took an apartment in New York City, and there he began writing his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned. When Zelda Fitzgerald became pregnant, they took their first trip to Europe in 1921, but then settled back in St. Paul, Minnesota, where Scott could finish his novel and they could wait for the arrival of their daughter, Frances, later known as Scotty, who was born in October of 1921. And again, it's time for another quick sidebar. The Fitzgerald daughter, Frances, whose nickname was Scotty, attended Vassar College and became a journalist and fiction writer who worked for the New York Post and the New Yorker, among other publications. She also became a prominent member of the Democratic Party. Scotty married Jack Lanahan in 1943, and after the war, he became a prominent Washington lawyer. The couple became popular hosts in Washington society in the 50s and 60s. During this period, she wrote and directed very well received musical comedies about the Washington social scene. Scotty and Jack had 4 children. You see them on the left of your screen, but went on to get a divorce in 1967. In 1973, after a failed second marriage, Scotty moved to her mother Zelda's hometown in Montgomery, Alabama, where she devoted the remainder of her life to voter outreach programs in Alabama. Scotty died from throat cancer in 1986, age 64, and she's buried next to her parents in Rockville, Maryland, where her father and grandfather had strong family roots. Now, meanwhile, back to Scotty's dad, Fitzgerald expected to become affluent from a play that he wrote called The Vegetable. And in the fall of 1922, he and Zelda and the baby moved to Great Neck, Long Island, in order to be near Broadway. Unfortunately, the play, which was a political satire, failed at its tryouts in November of 1923. And as a result, Fitzgerald had to write his way out of debt with short stories. Now, by this point in his life, Fitzgerald was at best a functioning alcoholic who wrote when sober, but partied all night. And Zelda Fitzgerald also got drunk regularly. And again, as I had said in that little sidebar, the beginnings of her decline in mental illness. And frankly, there were a lot of booze-fueled domestic rows. Now, his reputation as a drinker inspired the myth that he was an irresponsible writer. Yet we know today from his manuscripts and you're going to see this in a video that I'm going to show a little later in this program, that he was a painstaking reviser whose fiction went through layers and layers of drafts. In clear, lyrical, colorful, and often witty language, Fitzgerald's work often focuses on the so-called American dream, the changing winds of fate, and the inevitability of loss. Now, as a social historian, Fitzgerald became identified with the Jazz Age. He famously wrote, "It was an age of miracles. It was an age of art. It was an age of excess, and it was an age of satire." Um, and I can't help but note the similarity. He's kind of tipping his hat to Charles Dickens here, the opening of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the time of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this is his version of it. It was an age of miracles. It was an age of art. It was an age of excess, and it was an age of satire. Well, after The Vegetable was a flop, he began outlining his third novel, The Great Gatsby, while living in Great Neck. But seeking tranquility for his work, the Fitzgeralds went to France in the spring of 1924. And he wrote the bulk of The Great Gatsby during the summer and fall near the town of Saint Raphael. It was during this summer that the marriage was truly damaged by Zelda's liaison with a French naval aviator, though the extent of the affair, if it was in fact consummated, is really not known. The Fitzgeralds spent late 1924 and early 1925 in Rome, where he revised The Great Gatsby. And they were en route to Paris in the April of 1925 when the novel with its striking front cover was published by Scribner's. Fitzgerald's achievement, unfortunately, only received modest critical praise, and the sales were truly disappointing. Well, in Paris, Fitzgerald attended Gertrude Stein's famous Saturday evening salon and met Ernest Hemingway, with whom he formed a friendship. Little sneak preview, we'll be doing a program about Gertrude Stein's salon early next year. Now, the Fitzgeralds remained in France until the end of 1926, where Scott made little progress on his fourth novel. And during these years, Zelda Fitzgerald's unconventional behavior became increasingly erratic. And again, I spoke about that in the little sidebar. Well, in the spring of 1927, the Fitzgeralds returned to America and eventually ended up in Ellerslie, a mansion near Wilmington, Delaware. And the family remained there for 2 years. But Fitzgerald was still unable to make significant progress on his novel. And I love that little headline. Author found no solace at the mansion. Now, at this time, Zelda Fitzgerald commenced ballet training. Why not? Intending to become a professional dancer. But unfortunately, as we heard a few minutes ago, by April of 1930, she suffered her first mental breakdown, and she was treated at a Prangen's clinic in Switzerland until September of the following year, 1931. Now, living in Swiss hotels, Scott put aside his novel in progress to write short stories to pay for Zelda's psychiatric treatments. Fitzgerald's peak story fee, by the way, of $4,000 from the Saturday Evening Post in 1930 had the purchasing power of about $40,000 in present-day dollars. Indeed, his novels earned relatively little, and most of his income came from these magazine stories. Regrettably, Scott and Zelda spent that money faster than he earned it. And now, yes, a lot of it was for her treatment in hospitals, but a lot of it, frankly, was just spent on party and booze. As one of his biographers, Kenneth Elba, reminds us, in any consideration of Fitzgerald's use of his talent, his inability to manage money is a central fact. And You're not the only author. For those of you who uh, remember the program that we gave about Mark Twain, oh, very, very similar story without the booze. Scott and Zelda returned to America in the fall of 1931 and rented a house in Zelda's hometown of Montgomery, Alabama, while Fitzgerald made an unsuccessful trip to Hollywood. It was actually his second trip there. Zelda suffered a mental relapse in February of 1932 and entered Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. And as we heard in the sidebar, she spent her last 16 years as a resident or outpatient in sanitariums and mental hospitals. And interestingly, she was not committed to any of these. She self-committed. She realized she was in pain. She realized she was in trouble, and she committed herself. So, in many respects, I have great admiration for Zelda, that she was able to do that. Now, as we heard earlier, it was during one of her hospital stays that Zelda wrote her only novel, Save Me the Waltz. Now, this highly autobiographical 1932 narrative generated considerable bitterness between the Fitzgerald because Scott felt that it used materials that he was using for his novel in progress called Tender is the Night. Published in 1934, that novel was Fitzgerald's most ambitious one, and it proved to be his greatest commercial failure. Well, the 1936 to 37 period is known as the crack up, from the title of an essay Fitzgerald wrote in 1936. Ill, drunk, and in debt, and unable to write commercial stories, he lived in hotels in the region near Asheville, North Carolina, where in 1936 Zelda Fitzgerald entered, again, Highland Hospital. Meanwhile, Fitzgerald rightly believed that he wasn't able or capable enough to manage a home for his daughter, Scotty. So when she was 14, she went to boarding school and was raised by Fitzgerald's literary agent, Harold Ober, and Ober's wife, Anne. Fitzgerald tried as best he could to act as a concerned father, but it was mainly by mail. And he attempted through mail to kind of supervise Scotty's education and to shape her social values. Again, I kind of give credit to Fitzgerald. I mean, I think he was very aware of his alcoholism, and he realized that he would probably end up doing more harm to Scotty than good. And so basically, Anne and Harold Ober took over as surrogate parents. Meanwhile, between 1927 and 1939, during that period, Fitzgerald worked on at least 7 major screen projects for various studios. At MGM, where he was given a weekly contract of $1,250 a week, that's big money, Fitzgerald worked on 3 important assignments. 3 Comrades, for which he received his only screen credit in 1938. Infidelity, intended for Joan Crawford, but canceled because the subject of adultery was seen as unfilmable unless the offending partner was punished in the movie. And probably the one that really got away, he wrote the original screenplay for the movie The Women, which of course was a smash hit. But ultimately, his script was completely rewritten by Anita Loos and Jane Murfin before the production, so he got no credit at all. The screenwriter Bud Schulberg, with whom Fitzgerald had worked on a movie assignment, said this. Unlike all the famous Eastern writers who came to Hollywood to replenish lost fortunes and take the money and run, Fitzgerald regarded the motion pictures as a unique 20th century art form that demanded as much serious attention as novels and plays. Now, in the end, however, like many things in Scott's life, Hollywood never panned out, and he returned to writing stories and another attempt at longer fiction. Meanwhile, during one of his stays in Hollywood in late 1937, Fitzgerald fell in love with the actress and movie columnist Sheila Graham. Their relationship endured until his death 3 years later, despite all of his benders. Now, in 1939, he began his Hollywood novel, The Love of the Last Tycoon, and had written more than half of the work when he died of a heart attack in Graham's apartment on December the 21st of 1940. He was only 44 years old. Fitzgerald died believing himself a failure. Although many of the obituaries were cautiously respectful, most cited him as a once-was writer who never lived up to his potential. Simply put, he seemed destined for literary obscurity, kind of as a one-hit wonder, as it were. Now, as we're going to hear in a few minutes, when we look at Fitzgerald's books, that obscurity began to dissipate during the Second World War, and by 1960, he had achieved a secure place among America's enduring writers, with The Great Gatsby often at the top of the list. Now, again, for more about Fitzgerald's life, please visit makingwings.net and take Deeper Dive number 106. Right now, what I'd like to do is spend time exploring the 8 major books published in his lifetime, as well as that remarkable unfinished novel. Now, we'll examine each in chronological order, and that means we're going to start with This Side of Paradise, which was the 1920 debut novel by the 24-year-old Fitzgerald. He took inspiration for the title from a line in Rupert Brooke's poem, Tiara Tahiti. The narrative examines the lives and morality of carefree American youth at the dawn of the Jazz Age. Its protagonist, Amory Blaine, is a handsome middle-class student at Princeton University who dabbles in literature and engages in a series of unfulfilling romances with young women. The novel explores how love can be distorted by greed and social ambition. By the way, I love the guy's name, Amory Lane. It's kind of like amorous, right? So, amore. So, Amory. Now, This Side of Paradise became a sensation, with reviewers hailing it as an outstanding debut. Published by Scribner's, the book sold out its first printing in just 3 days and went through 12 printings, selling nearly 50,000 copies. It was his most successful book. Now, although the book neither became the best-selling novel of the year, that honor went to Zane Grey's kidnapping saga, The Man of the Forest, nor did it make him wealthy, it did make F. Scott Fitzgerald a household name overnight. His novel became especially popular among younger American readers, and the press depicted its 20-something author as the standard bearer for youth in revolt. Meanwhile, thanks to the success of Paradise, Fitzgerald's literary agent, Harold Ober, who was soon to be kind of the surrogate dad of his daughter, Scotty, he was able to negotiate the sale of 6 of Scott's stories to the Saturday Evening Post, to whom he would eventually sell 65 of his stories. That's around 40% of his total short narrative output. Further, in September of 1920, Scribner's published 8 of those stories in a volume titled Flappers and Philosophers. Each of the stories had originally appeared independently in either the Saturday Evening Post, Scribner's Magazine, or the Smart Set. And of the 8 tales, the Ice Palace is consistently cited as one of Fitzgerald's best stories and one of the best stories in 20th century American lit. The short story collection further solidified Fitzgerald's fame. In fact, Matthew Broccoli notes that during his lifetime, Fitzgerald was far better known and more widely read as a short story writer than as a novelist. In its September 26, 1920 review of Flappers and Philosophers, the New York Times compared the collection to that novel, This Side of Paradise. The review said, his 8 short stories range from the gamut of style and mood with a brilliance and jus perle, so to speak, which is not to be found in his novel. The reviewer compared the stories favorably to the Russian school, think Chekhov, right? And to the American author O. Henry. Well, 2 years later, Fitzgerald dropped another pair of books on the reading public, I should say. First, in March, his novel The Beautiful and Damned hit the bookstores. Set in New York City, the novel's plot follows a young artist, Anthony Patch, and his flapper wife, Gloria Gilbert, who become wrecked on the shoals of dissipation while partying to excess in the dawning years of the self-indulgent jazz age. The novel zeroes in on the swinish behavior and glittering excesses of the American nouveau riche in the halcyon days of New York's cafe society. Now, the novel's plot draws heavily on the early years of the Fitzgerald's own tempestuous and frequently unhappy marriage, following the unexpected success of the author's first novel. In fact, commenting on their marriage, in a 1938 letter to his daughter, Scotty, Fitzgerald said, I decided to marry your mother after all, even though I knew she was spoiled and meant no good to me. I was sorry immediately I had married her, but being patient in those days made the best of it. Kind of curious as to how the teenage daughter Scotty took to that letter. But anyway, thanks, Dad. Well, in a satirical review of the novel, The Beautiful and the Damned, and that was for the New York Tribune, Zelda, his wife, wrote that her husband had borrowed heavily from her diaries and letters that she had used for her novel, and apparently seemed to believe, and I love this line, my husband seems to believe that plagiarism begins at home. It's probably one of my favorite literary one-liners. Well, Fitzgerald sought to improve on the form and construction of his prose style in The Beautiful and Damned, and he revised his second novel based on editorial suggestions from his friend Edmund Wilson and his editor Maxwell Perkins. According to Scott Berg in his biography of Perkins, the editor Perkins, when reviewing the manuscript, Perkins commented on the conspicuous evolution of Fitzgerald's literary craftsmanship. Well, after being serialized in Metropolitan magazine, Scribner's published the hardcover version of The Beautiful and Damned in March of 1922. Scribner's prepared an initial run of 20,000 copies. Now, although not among the best-selling novels of the year, the book sold well enough to warrant an additional printing of 50,000 copies. But again, even that first novel, as much as it made him a household name, these weren't necessarily gangbuster numbers. He wasn't a Zane Grey, okay? Fitzgerald was, interestingly enough, never completely happy with this book. In a letter to Zelda that he wrote in 1930, he said, "I wish The Beautiful and Damned had been a maturely written book because it was all true." And then he kind of slips into autobiography here. He says to her, "We ruined ourselves. But I have never honestly thought that we ruined each other." So they had some honest dialogue there. Now, as a quick side note, Hollywood made an adaptation of the novel that was released in January of 1923, just less than a year after the book was published. Now, while the film was a success at the box office and with critics, Scott and Zelda disliked the film deeply. Scott later wrote to a friend, "It's by far the worst movie I've ever seen in my life. Cheap, vulgar, ill-constructed, and shoddy. We were utterly ashamed of it." Now, the movie is currently listed as a lost film, and no copies of it are known to exist. And that's also the case, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, also the case for the 1926 adaptation of The Great Gatsby for the big silver screen. Scott and Zelda hated that one so much that they actually walked out halfway through it at the premiere. Now, the follow-up to the novel was another collection of stories, Tales of the Jazz Age. It's a collection of 11 short stories that's divided into 3 separate parts. It includes one of his better-known short stories, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, as has been the case, excuse me, as had been the case with Flappers and Philosophers. All the stories had appeared previously in a kind of a who's who of highly regarded popular magazines, including Vanity Fair, Smart Set, the Saturday Evening Post, and Metropolitan Magazine. Now, as a little sidebar, the 2008 film version of Benjamin Button with Brad Pitt and a cast of A-list actresses garnered 13 Oscar nominations and 3 wins. The movie retains the story's quite original core concept of aging in reverse, born old and then gets younger and younger as the book goes along, excuse me, as the story goes along. But the movie expands the narrative and adds new characters. So while the short story becomes kind of a straightforward account of Benjamin's success in family, business, and world traveling, the film is a romantic drama that ends up ruminating on Benjamin's existential predicament. Still, in all, both versions of the story are worth a read and a look. So read the story, then see the magazine, see which one you like. Now, Tales of the Jazz Age received somewhat lukewarm critical reviews upon its initial publication. In the New York Times of October 1922, critic Hildegard Hawthorne said that the stories give too much of the effect of samples. The book is more like a magazine than a collection of stories by one man, arranged by an editor to suit all tastes, and meant to be thrown away after a reading. Now, today, however, the collection is considered insightful and richly written. Matthew Broccoli says this: F. Scott Fitzgerald's short stories remain a misunderstood and underrated aspect of his career. They've been dismissed as hack work and condemned for impeding his serious work. Certainly they are uneven, but Fitzgerald's best stories are among the best in American literature. And then comes Happy Birthday, The Great Gatsby, published by Scribner's in April of 1925. The novel is actually set in the summer of 1922 in the fictional towns of West Egg and East Egg on Long Island and in Manhattan. In it, Nick Carraway, who's the narrator, becomes entangled in the lives of tennis star Jordan Baker, his cousin Daisy Buchanan and her brutish husband Tom, a couple named George and Myrtle Wilson, and most especially his mysterious neighbor, Jay Gatsby. Now, Gatsby is a wealthy and enigmatic man known for his extravagant parties and his unrequited love for Daisy. The novel explores doomed relationships as well as the themes of wealth and class structure, with Gatsby's pursuit of success and love serving as a symbol of the slippery and often inaccessible nature of the American dream. Indeed, the novel vividly explores the moral and social decay behind, and I should say beneath the surface of the glittering jazz age, and portrays dissipation and moral bankruptcy of the period in a biting analysis of American society at the time. Now, significant film adaptations include the 1949 version with Alan Ladd as Gatsby, the lavish 1974 film starring Robert Redford, who, as you know, just passed away yesterday as Gatsby, a very flat-footed television version with Toby Stevens broadcast in 2000, and the 2013 Baz Luhrmann extravaganza spectacle featuring Leonardo DiCaprio. And despite their flaws, all four of these cinematic interpretations have contributed to the enduring popularity and cultural impact of Fitzgerald's masterpiece. Now, the novel was in part inspired by Fitzgerald's youthful romance with the socialite Ginevra King and by the riotous parties he attended on Long Island's North Shore in 1922. Following a move to the French Riviera, Fitzgerald completed a rough draft of his novel in 1924. His editor, Maxwell Perkins, persuaded Fitzgerald to revise the work. And after making those revisions, Fitzgerald was satisfied but remained ambivalent about what to call the book. What should I call this book? What should be its title? And he actually considered several, including Among Ash Heaps and Millionaires, Under the Red, White, and Blue, Gold-Hatted Gatsby, and The High Bouncing Lover. But his top contender was Trimalchio, which refers to a character, Trimalchio, in the ancient Roman satire called the Satyricon. And that story is certainly known, famous for its depiction of lavish and extravagant parties. Well, ultimately, Perkins rejected all of these, and he suggested The Great Gatsby. And Fitzgerald initially resisted, but he eventually gave in and said, okay, we'll call it The Great Gatsby. And aren't we glad he did? Now, as a sidebar for literature trivia buffs, Fitzgerald was still editing the novel when he saw Francis Cugat's proposed dust jacket art named Celestial Eyes. You see it on your screen. He was so impressed that he decided to incorporate the eye imagery of Cugat's painting into the novel in the guise of a derelict billboard that advertised the eyeglasses of Dr. T. J. Eckelberg. But above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T. J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T. J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or forgot them and moved away. Well, in turn, scholarly evidence suggests that George Orwell, who appreciated Fitzgerald's writing style perhaps a little more than Gatsby itself, well, he was, however, inspired by the symbolism of the billboard in that novel with Eckelberg's eyes. And so when he was developing the concept of Big Brother in 1984, he decided to kind of use a variation on it. It was one of those pictures, he says, which are so contrived that the eye follows you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you. The caption beneath it ran. So it's a great example of art inspiring art. Meanwhile, Gatsby received very mixed reviews. In fact, some deemed it unimportant, painfully forced, no more than a glorified anecdote, and a dud. And compared to his earlier novels, Gatsby was truly a commercial disappointment. It sold fewer than 20,000 copies in his lifetime. And Fitzgerald's hopes of a monetary windfall from the novel were absolutely unrealized. In fact, in a letter to Zelda written just a few months before he died in 1940, he wrote, "My God, I am a forgotten man." Indeed, when he died in 1940, only a handful of people attended his funeral. But, and I had alluded to this early in our presentation, so how is he so famous today? What happened? Well, this is what happened. There was a posthumous turnaround. During World War II, the novel experienced an abrupt surge in popularity when the Council on Books in Wartime distributed 155,000 free copies of The Great Gatsby to American soldiers serving overseas. Guess what? The book was a big hit with the troops. This newfound popularity launched a critical and scholarly reexamination, and the work soon became a core part of most English class curricula in high schools and colleges, and a part of American popular culture. The Great Gatsby is now widely considered to be a literary masterpiece and one of several contenders for the title of the great American novel. Well, for the 100th birthday of this landmark novel, back in April of this year, CBS presented a short tribute on its weekend show Sunday morning. Perhaps you're familiar with it. It's a great show. I'd like you to watch that segment now. Now, two quick notes. You may have to adjust the sound on your devices. And as always, YouTube closed captioning, as we know, can get a little wonky at times. But here is a really good focus on Gatsby. Happy birthday, Great Gatsby.
In American literary history, few novels have loomed as large as F. Scott Fitzgerald's 1925 classic, The Great Gatsby. Lee Cowan takes us back in time.
Dotting the water's edge of Long Island's Manhasset Bay, the opulence of the homes speaks for itself, but not nearly as well as F. Scott Fitzgerald once spoke of that opulence.
A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling.
That wedding cake of a ceiling likely did look down on Gatsby-esque parties back in the day.
The bar is in full swing, and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside until the air is alive with chatter and laughter and casual innuendo.
I can almost hear the music playing and feel the spirits of, the parties that went on here.
Fitzgerald lived in a much more modest house just a few miles away while he was writing The Great Gatsby. Elena and George Scheedinger, though, believe he must have visited here. They imagine him while tilting his head back to down a bootleg cocktail. Fitzgerald took note and then wrote their ceiling into his novel.
I absolutely believe that to be true.
That Fitzgerald was here.
Yeah.
His novel came out 100 years ago this month. Scholars consider it a literary masterpiece. Hollywood finds it irresistible.
How do you do, old sport? I'm Gatsby.
And so does Broadway. There's even a recent graphic novel of Gatsby that brings Fitzgerald's characters to life. Starting with James Gatz. He believed he was too poor to marry the rich girl of his dreams, so he reinvents himself.
Afraid I haven't been a very good host, old sport. You see, I'm Gatsby.
It's less about love and more about longing, his especially, for Daisy Buchanan, just across the bay.
I don't want to go home.
And don't.
They were so near, and yet worlds apart.
I hadn't realized that either side of the bay that they were so close to one another, and that you almost could look into the windows on the other side.
That's Blake Hazard, the great-granddaughter of Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. That's her grandmother as a baby. They are celebrated relatives who she says are looming lovingly large on this centennial.
I've gotten used to witnessing these kinds of things about my family, about my great-grandfather with other people and sharing it, and I think that feels right.
Many places inspired Scott.
Gatsby tours have become popular.
This is where The Great Gatsby is set.
This one run by Kevin C. Fitzpatrick, an author and New York historian.
There's a point where we're in the middle of Manhasset Bay, and you can look to the left to West Egg and to the right to East Egg, and people just click. Because they can picture that green light on that dock.
Maine, most never survived the Great Depression. Torn down to make room for the new. But back in Manhattan, some of the Gatsby lore remains, especially here at the Plaza Hotel.
There's a story that Zelda would come in here and just go around and around and around.
It was a temple to the times where important people did important things, including Blake's great-grandparents.
They both really wanted to be in the world, of the world, writing about what they saw, chronicling it all, and
having a good time doing it.
And having a great time doing it.
The Fitzgeralds were not wealthy themselves. While they did enjoy money, they were amused with its perils, too.
They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together.
He was drawn to these things, but also very much an observer of them, felt very outside of, certainly of the wealthy set.
He did rub elbows with the wealthy set at Princeton. Although he later dropped out, his papers found their way back.
Let's take a look.
Oh, wow.
Including the only surviving handwritten manuscript of Gatsby.
Here we have entire, half a page scribbled out. The whole book is like this. And
Emma Sarconi is a rare book librarian at Princeton's Special Collections at the Firestone Library.
He was very exacting as to what he wanted the book to be.
At the time, Fitzgerald was coming off 2 big hits, and he believed that Gatsby would surpass both of them. But Gatsby landed with a thud.
How many copies did it originally sell?
Less than 20,000.
Jeez.
Yeah.
How did he react to the mixed reviews?
He was devastated. He wrote a letter to his daughter Scotty sort of in his final years, lamenting the fact that none of her friends would know who he was.
So what changed? Well, the times, perhaps. During World War II, the newly formed Council on Books in Wartime shipped millions of pocket-sized books to keep the troops entertained overseas.
This copy is relatively small,
including 155,000 copies of The Great Gatsby.
We wouldn't be talking about this book today if this edition hadn't come out.
Fitzgerald died long before that, at the age of 44. At that point, he thought he was a failure.
He had really fallen into obscurity. Famously, very few people attended his funeral.
And yet today, Gatsby rubs dust jackets with the likes of Jane Austen, Steinbeck, and Hemingway. For many, The Great Gatsby is indeed the great American novel.
It sounds silly, but I wish Scott could be here. I just think he'd be so thrilled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And surprised, probably,
And
right?
surprised. Certainly surprised.
Among the few keepsakes that Blake has are her great-grandmother's necklace, given to Zelda by Scott, as well as this ring. Coincidence the stone is green? Well, we'll never know.
Gatsby believed in the green light.
That haunting green light blinks for all of us. Dreams, perfection, whatever eludes us. We still keep trying.
So we beat on. Boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
That's such a nice overview, really excellently done. So I'm glad I could share that with you. Now, let's face it, we could spend the rest of this hour just discussing the place names, the symbols, and the themes of this book. For example, as we just saw in the CBS video, on one side of Manhasset Bay is West Egg, where Gatsby and the New Money crowd lived in the novel. It's based on the actual town of Great Neck, specifically the area around Kings Point. On the other side of the bay is East Egg, where Daisy and Tom Buchanan, along with the Old Money folks, take up residence. It's modeled after Port Washington, with Sands Point being a key inspiration. Old versus new, rich versus wannabe rich, and the truths and lies of the American dream that East and West Egg represent are just a few of numerous symbols and metaphors that make the novel such a rich reading experience. Again, for more information, I have a number of links on my website that can allow you to take even deeper dives into this really remarkable book. Well, meanwhile, as he did after the publication of his first two novels, Fitzgerald buttressed Gatsby with a short story collection. And this one was called All the Sad Young Men. Now, as was the case with his previous two anthologies, the 9 stories originally appeared independently in popular literary journals. And the collection was published in early 1926 by Scribner's. In a letter to Maxwell Perkins, Scott wrote that 7 of the stories deal with young men of my generation in rather unhappy moods. And that's what justifies the title of the collection. Fitzgerald wrote the stories at a time of disillusionment. He was in deep financial difficulty. He believed his wife Zelda to be romantically involved with other men. Zelda had suffered a series of mental and physical breakdowns, and to top it off, his play, The Vegetable, had been a miserable failure. Well, upon the publication of Sad Young Men, critics were decidedly lukewarm. For example, the New York Times, which had given Gatsby one of its few positive reviews, wrote, "It must be said that the collection as a whole is not sustained to the high excellence of The Great Gatsby, but it has some stories of fine insight and finished craft." Very lukewarm. Well, All of this bad press, the lack of sales, his alcoholism, Zelda, it took over 8 years for Fitzgerald to produce another book called Tender is the Night, which came out in April of 1934. Turned out to be the last novel published in Scott's lifetime. The story follows Dick Diver and his wife Nicole's complicated and tumultuous relationship while in the French Riviera near the end of the Roaring Twenties. Once again, Fitzgerald created an intensely autobiographical work, closely mirroring Scott's relationship with Zelda. One of the major tensions in the novel is Dick's increasing alcoholism and Nicole's declining mental health, as well as Dick's affair with a young actress that pushes him further away from Nicole. And of course, that kind of it parallels his relationship with Sheila Graham. Now, Tender is the Night was first serialized in Scribner's magazine, and the responses were again mixed at best. Indeed, contrary to Fitzgerald's expectations that Tender is the Night would revive his reputation as an author of serious long fiction, sales for the hardcover version were the poorest of all his major works. Even worse than Gatsby. This one only sold 13,000 copies total. It was only after his death that the novel came to be considered one of Fitzgerald's best works by many scholars. Scott considered Tender is the Night his masterpiece and was deeply disappointed when it didn't receive the critical and public success that he expected. Friend and contemporary Ernest Hemingway disagreed with that public sentiment, stating that the genius of the novel became more apparent to him with each additional reading. Scott never understood the lackluster response to his most labored over work, worrying over it for the rest of his life. That's the words of Hemingway. Well, the film version of the novel with Jason Robards and Jennifer Jones became a big hit in 1962. And a little trivia, right? Its title song, sung by Tony Bennett, was actually nominated for an Academy Award. Now, the film follows the overall plot of the novel, but it doesn't replicate the very complex structure of the novel, which moves around in time and setting. Well, still, it's a good popcorn movie for a rainy night. Have some fun. Great cast. Now, today, two versions of the novel are in print. The first version, the original from 1934, uses flashbacks and changes of setting to build mystery and reveal the story's complexities. The second revised version, prepared by Fitzgerald's friend and critic Malcolm Cowley in 1948, used revision notes left by Fitzgerald and presents a straightforward chronological account of the plot. So the original kind of bounces around from year to year to year, back in time, forward in time, etc. The 48 version follows a strict chronology. First this happened, then this happens, and this happens, and this happens. Okay. Both are interesting, but most critics feel that it's the 1934 version that is really the superior one. Now, as he had with his three other novels, Fitzgerald followed Tender is the Night with a short story collection called Taps at Reveille. It's a collection of 18 short stories, so it's the longest of the anthologies, published by Scribner's, his publisher, in March of 1935. And the anthology includes several stories featuring autobiographical creations derived from Fitzgerald's youth, namely 5 stories about Basil Duke Lee and 3 about Josephine Perry. And the final story in the collection, Babylon Revisited, is today considered a masterpiece of short story narrative. It's consistently listed as, one of the top 10 best stories in American literature, especially of the 20th century. Now, the New York Times critic Edith Walton gave Fitzgerald's final collection a somewhat mixed reception. It has become a dreadful commonplace to say that Mr. Fitzgerald's material is rarely worthy of his talents. Unfortunately, however, the platitude represents truth. Scott Fitzgerald's mastery of style, swift, sure, polished, firm, is so complete that even his most trivial efforts are dignified by his technical competence. All his writings has a glorious gloss upon it. It is always entertaining. It is always beautifully executed. But, there's a big but in there, right? But. And finally, there's the unfinished novel, The Last Tycoon. Based on the career of real-life producer Irving Thalberg, the head of MGM, who was later known as Hollywood's boy wonder, The Last Tycoon is a sharply observed and bittersweet expose of the glittering excess of the Hollywood film industry in its prime. Fitzgerald first conceived the idea for The Last Tycoon in 1931 when he met Thalberg in Hollywood. But sadly, Thalberg died of pneumonia in 1936 at only the age of 37. Fitzgerald worked on the manuscript on and off for the rest of his own brief life. Scott wanted to finish the novel, which he called The Love of the Last Tycoon, a Western, by January of 1941. That was his goal. I want to get this done by January 41, and he wanted to begin selling it by the fall of that year. But he was behind schedule when he died of heart failure in December of 1940. His mistress, Sheila Graham, attributed this to two main reasons. First, the novel had expanded from what had originally been planned. And second, Fitzgerald could only work on the novel sporadically owing to his ill health, translate that, alcoholism, and the financial necessity that he had to take time off to write the short stories. According to Graham, in her 1976 memoir, The Real F. Scott Fitzgerald, Graham says, at the time of his death, the novel was a little more than half finished. Well, in 1941, a close friend of Fitzgerald, the writer Edmund Wilson, collected the 17 finished chapters, as well as the notes for the rest of the book, edited them, and published the novel under the title The Last Tycoon. Now, in 1993, his biographer, Matthew Broccoli, reworked the existing chapters and extensive notes and published a complete version under Scott's original title, The Love of the Last Tycoon, a Western. Now, Publishers Weekly praised Broccoli's scholarship and noted that it restored Fitzgerald's original vision and has also restored the narrative's original working title, one that implies that Hollywood is the last American frontier where immigrants and their progeny remake themselves. Following Fitzgerald's death, his editor, Maxwell Perkins, wrote a letter to Sheila Graham stating that the first chapter alone is good enough to stand by itself. It breaks a man's heart to see what this book could have been. Now, meanwhile, there have been several film and television adaptations of The Last Tycoon, most of which failed with critics and audiences, but at least one theatrical version did quite nicely. In 1998, a stage adaptation by Simon Levy, which was authorized by the Fitzgerald estate, opened at the Fountain Theater in Los Angeles and has gone on to have productions around the country and abroad. Well, there you have it in 75 minutes. A brief look at the life of Fitzgerald and a look at his story collections and novels, with a special emphasis, of course, on The Great Gatsby, whose 100th birthday we celebrate this year. Again, for more information, please take a deeper dive 106 on my website, makingwings.net. And now, before we talk about our next presentation, it's time for your thoughts and ideas. Thanks for being here today.